Welcome back to the DAT Slayer. This is part 3. So just um, I guess looking forward to what we'll talk about now, study strategies. For biology, you're going to memorize, review, and practice. For Gen Chem, same thing. OChem, same thing. For the perceptual ability test and reading, it's basically just straight practice. There's no memorizing or reviewing that you can really do here. For math, there's going to be some memorization and review, but mostly practice as well. So the biology section, like I said before, you're going to be making study guides from the Kaplan Blue Book and the Cliff Notes AP Bio. And so here's an example of the Microsoft Word documents that I had for my study guides. And you can see here, I used highlighting quite a bit as studying tricks. I'd recommend you do that. For instance, everything that's highlighted yellow I made into flashcards, so I knew I wouldn't have to look at this specific line or this chunk right here as much on my study guide because it was in a flashcard that I'd look at there. For green, these were notes I added later or notes that needed extra review. So this kind of helps me review my study guides faster because I would look specifically for green stuff or also purple things, which were things I found on practice exams that weren't in my notes or textbooks. Also, I used a red font for ridiculous memorization tricks. And these helped a ton because ultimately this is a multiple choice exam. So for instance, microfilaments has an A in it, microtubules does not, so that helped me to remember that these are made of actin. Intermediate filaments were made of keratin, so the ER helped me there. And you'll see a couple more of those. Like periphery, they had pores in them, like sea sponges have pores in them. Cnidaria, I felt like this was a pointless C because it was silent. Just like, they have a digestive sac that's sealed at one end, and in my mind that's kind of pointless as well. So that may not make a ton of sense, but it helped me remember it. I never forgot it, and it really works for the exam. Also, things I highlighted red were just things, last minute notes that I took 1 to 2 days before the exam. So that was an even more condensed way for me to review my study guides, was just to mainly look at the red stuff. And here's just one more example. I would take pictures as well in the Kaplan Blue Book and paste them onto my study guides so I wouldn't have to crack open the Blue Book later. And then here's just a list of all the chapters from the Blue Book that I turned into study guides. So then for the DAT Destroyer biology questions, here's an example of how I studied that. So each line would be dedicated to a specific question in the Destroyer. And as you can see, I would star things that I didn't know or I was unsure about or I wanted to look over. Even if I got it wrong, I would mark things wrong that I definitely got wrong. So I'd definitely look at the stars and the incorrect ones. And sometimes I would take brief notes from the explanation of the answer, just so I could, review that again later. I could go back to this and not crack open the actual Destroyer, but I could just read these notes I took just to remind myself of things that I missed or was unsure about. And then orange was just memorization tricks again. And I would also use a blue highlighter for the most important notes that I definitely wanted to review multiple times. So then we'll talk about flashcards. So the strategy I used helped me to memorize several hundred flashcards that were loaded with information, and I think it's one of the best ways to study flashcards, so we'll go over that. So the first step was once a week I would review all of my flashcards, and then as I did that I would separate the cards I did know from the cards I didn't know. And then every day for the rest of the week I would review the cards that I didn't know pile. And so as each card is mastered from that pile, I would move it to the cards I knew pile. Thus, your daily pile that you're reviewing is shrinking down until the start of a new week where you start over and go over everything all over again. Just keep it all fresh in the mind. And sometimes I would also add cards as needed or add notes to those cards and memorization tricks as I studied and took practice exams. So here's an example of what that looks like. So there'd be two piles of cards, the left and right, each separated during the week by cards I knew and cards I didn't know. And so for my chemistry and math cards, I had roughly 60, and for biology cards, I had roughly 150. And some of them were pretty brief, simple definition type flashcards. Others were like a copy and paste of what Chad would write on the whiteboard, what I converted into my notebook and then converted onto a flashcard. And this study strategy, it looks overwhelming, but it's amazing what you can do when you're reviewing all of your cards once a week and then the ones you don't know every single day. I was able to basically memorize all of these things and memorize even the locations of them and kind of see it with a photographic memory by the end of it. So then for general chemistry, here's an example of the notes that I took with Chad's videos. It's basically copying down everything that he wrote or talked about. I would highlight things to help me review later. For instance, I would once I took all the notes, I would review them all and then make note cards out of the stuff I knew I needed to memorize. And then everything else I would highlight so I would know just to look at that specifically and trust that everything else I either already knew for sure or it was on a flashcard. And it made it a lot faster to review these notes later on. Also, just make sure to write cleanly and easily, write cleanly and spaciously so that you can easily add stuff later on if you need to. And then here's an example of the DAT Destroyer Gen Chem questions, very similar to the biology ones, where I had notes and highlighting and things. OChem, again, here's the Chad's video notes and DAT Destroyer questions. And so for the perceptual ability test, there's going to be a link to the DAT Bootcamp website, and they have videos of specific strategies that you can use for each section of the perceptual ability test. And I would highly recommend you use these exact strategies because I didn't come across these videos until after I took the test, the real one. And it turned out that the same strategies that I found to work best were the ones that Bootcamp were using. And so they give a great explanation of those here. And after you do that, just practice the perceptual ability test with Crack the DAT and other practice tests. And you could also review answers with friends, maybe take some PAT practice tests with friends and then see what their strategies are, get some ideas, and you can decide for yourself what's best. And then in addition to those strategies from Bootcamp, I also use this one specifically for the angles section, which really helped me out. So suppose that you come across this question and 2 and 4 look the same to you. What I did was I would lean my head so that my eyes were parallel with this bottom line, and I would imagine a right angle there. And then I'd lean my head the same for number 4 and imagine a right angle there. And as I looked back and forth and saw in my mind that right angle, I was able to see more easily that this was the bigger angle compared to 2. And so this kind of seems like a crazy strategy, at least it might, but I tried this strategy, I tried other strategies for the angles part of the PAT, and this one got me higher scores consistently. And so you can bet that I used a lot of head leaning and right angle imagining on the real exam. Just a side note, and with the entire PAT, use strategies that work the best for you. And a caution, the answers here show that 4 is larger than 2. All the answers do. So it would actually be a waste of your time to compare those two. But you will come across situations where those look the same and there's answers that are contradicting each other. So just a summary of what the bootcamp videos talk about as far as studying for the PAT. Just remember this is a multiple choice test, so use the answer choices to your advantage, such as the process of elimination, which is good for a lot of these sections of the PAT. For top front end, there's also 3D visualization. For angles, there's also rapid eye movement and visualizing a right angle like I just showed. For hole punches, you want to use the grid system. For cube counting, tallying is the best. And then for pattern folding, you want to match the sides that would be touching after folded up. So reading. The reading strategy I liked the best was search and destroy. And what this means is, the paragraphs in the reading sections are numbered. Therefore, as I quickly skimmed the passage, I would write down a brief, usually 1 to 4 words, summary and key words of each paragraph. And the list that I made helped me to quickly find answers to each question by identifying the paragraph it is in or near. And so ultimately you want to remember, what is the question asking for, and where am I most likely going to find the answer. So the search and destroy strategy really helps me to be efficient with this section instead of reading the whole thing. Although in some cases the answer, I couldn't find it in the location that seemed most likely, so I had to quickly skim the whole passage for a keyword or phrase from the question or answer choices. And if that still didn't work, then I would just mark it, guess an answer, and then try to come back later if I still had time. So my handwriting, as you can see, is pretty atrocious, but I could read it, and here's just an example of the search and destroy method that worked really well for me. The math strategy. So what you'll do is watch Chad's videos, take notes, make flashcards, take his practice quizzes, and then after that just keep practicing. What I would recommend you do is take a timed practice exam just of the math section at the end of the study day when you're spending time on the math section, and review the problems you missed, and then come back the next morning and re-practice the problems you missed the day before. And what this helped me to do was get the hang of types of questions that I was struggling with consistently. Also, I'd recommend you read this article. It's about boosting your quantitative reasoning or your math score by correctly using the mark feature, or basically the mark and skip, because this was a problem I ran into. Was I would get stuck on more complicated math problems, and then I wasn't able to finish the easier ones in time. So then I will also share with you a link from DAT Bootcamp where they have a bunch of other strategies and tips. It's a really good website you should just explore. Even if you aren't subscribed, they have a lot of links and a lot of articles that you can read to kind of get an idea of study ideas. So make sure to tune in to part 4 of the DAT Slayer, where we will conclude by going over the DAT study schedule.